Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second of our lectures in rewriting skyscraper history. Tonight's speaker is Lee Gray, who is a great expert on elevator history, and he will be talking about passenger elevators following on the launch of our semester-long course that looks at many topics of rethinking high-rise history, but also thinking about the history of technology, the history of cities, and a whole range of topics that make the rich narratives of the development of the high rise in its first decades in the last quarter of the 19th century. So last time, Tom Leslie talked about grain elevators in Chicago, and now Lee Gray will turn the focus to New York in particular, and talk about the introduction into the office building of the technology of the hoist and the development of the passenger elevator. This continuing series will alternate weeks in paired talks that are going to explore different topics, so that the next time that we meet in another 2 weeks will be an exploration of structure and the transition from masonry to metal in a pair of talks that once again bring in Tom Leslie, but is paired this time with Donald Friedman, a structural engineer and the author of Structure in Skyscrapers, a specialist on New York. So this dialogue between New York and Chicago is something that we're going to continue to explore. I will, after this short introduction with a few slides that I'll be showing you in a second, the pre-recorded lecture of Lee Gray will begin. And then after that has concluded, it's about 40 minutes, we'll have a discussion and bring Tom Leslie back into the dialogue, and have Tom and Lee with a few questions by me being posed of issues raised in the course of the 2 lectures so far. So here first are a few slides and thinking about this topic of rewriting skyscraper history. Thanks. So welcome to an ambitious title, a rather grandiose, Rewriting Skyscraper History, and also looking back from the 21st century. Tonight's lecture is the second of this pair that looks at New York and Chicago from the 1870s, or even before, with Tom Leslie, in order to think about tall buildings and new technologies very broadly, the technologies that allow the cities to rise and the buildings to rise, and the process of industrialization and how technology connects to that. So I just wanted to show you for a second a view of New York imagined, and New York of the future, because it's from Harper's Weekly in 1870. And that is before there is a single tall building on the skyline. There are no passenger elevator office buildings before 1874 and 75, as you'll learn shortly from Lee. There also is no Brooklyn Bridge that you see here in this engraving. That is previsioning the future of New York by combining those two cities and to bring the commerce of both together, but especially into Lower Manhattan, where in just 4 years from the publication of this engraving, the first tall office buildings will rise, the Tribune and the Western Union. So the first buildings that are 10 stories tall. But I want to recall in this wonderful Joshua Beale photograph of 1876, the other masonry tradition and the marriage of steel technology, steel cables, which have not yet been strung to connect the towers of the Brooklyn Bridge. And you see in the background of the horizon, the spiky points of the towers of the Tribune, just to the left of the Manhattan column of the tower of the Brooklyn Bridge. See some additional tall buildings. You see the Western Union building on the far left, and you see some church spires as well, which had previously been the only verticals that punctuated the 4- and 5-story city. And I especially wanted to bring the Brooklyn Bridge into the mix because I'd always thought that we wanted to address it in this course, and there didn't seem to be a perfect place to fit or a perfect person to talk about it. But in fact, we have found that person. He was not by any means hiding, but across my screen one day was a notice of the new the new book by Richard Haw, and I'm going to show it to you here, Engineering America, The Life and Times of John A. Roebling. This is not Richard's first book on, well, the Brooklyn Bridge. He's written two previous other ones on their cultural history, but this one is a biography of John A. Roebling. So the senior Roebling, the tradition of the engineer and businessman coming together and finding its apotheosis in the masterwork, the Brooklyn Bridge. This talk has been added in our book talk series, and you'll find it on our website, and it's going to be next Tuesday at 6 o'clock. So I invite you to sign up for that then, and to now enjoy the talk that Lee is going to perform, first in video and then live.
Good evening. Tonight we're going to talk about elevators, but this time, as opposed to elevators that contain grain and other agricultural products, we're going to talk about elevators that house passengers. And we're going to look at it from the viewpoint of tall buildings and new technologies. And we're going to begin not with tall buildings, but with a sort of prelude, what came before elevator use in what we think of as tall buildings or office buildings. And the reason we're beginning there is that when the elevator is first introduced as a passenger carrying technology, freight elevators had existed for some time. The passenger elevators first introduced in very distinct settings, first in hotels and then later in large shops. And it is viewed as a sort of luxury item. And we can see that in the first building one of the first buildings to have a passenger elevator, the Fifth Avenue Hotel in New York. And we're accustomed to seeing building names followed by the architect. In this instance, we're giving elevators pride of place in the elevator manufacturer. Fifth Avenue Hotel, the elevator builder, was a Boston engineer named Otis Tufts. Now, unfortunately, and here is the Fifth Avenue Hotel, we don't have any images of the elevator that was installed in the Fifth Avenue Hotel. What we do know is the concept. It was conceived of as a vertical railway. We know that it moved very, very slowly, and we know that it had a very particular design when it came to the car. The car had beautiful upholstered seats, mirrors, chandelier hanging down, and it was this opulent little room that I could ride up and down the Fifth Avenue Hotel and therefore not have to climb the stairs. So it was a luxury item in the hotel, like many other luxury items that we found in large urban hotels, that new building type that emerges in the mid-19th century. If we look at the Grand Pacific Hotel in Chicago, some 13 years later, now, although we've moved ahead in time, and regrettably, we don't know who built the elevators in the Grand Pacific Hotel, we have a little insight into its use in the world of the large urban hotel. So here's the Grand Pacific Hotel. It's a massive hotel built in Chicago, and the plan for this building survives. The plan published in 1870 when the building was under construction. The building finished in 1873. And for the ground floor, we see all of the amenities that surrounded the large rotunda for the hotel, shops, billiard rooms, and so on. Dead center, we see a large set of stairs. And if we focus in on that set of stairs, you'll notice at the top of the image where it says ladies reception room, and then a dimension immediately below that, you can barely make out the words ladies elevator. The Grand Pacific Hotel had two passenger elevators. One for women, most specifically unaccompanied women who were staying in the hotel, and then one for men, or for men who were accompanied by their wives. So the elevator in the hotel is not only a luxury item, it was also something, and this may have been a unique instance, we're not sure, but it was also an item that was used to help reinforce social mores at the time. So it has a very particular sort of image to it that is far removed from the notion of an office building elevator. We get the best sense of that if we look at Lord and Taylor from 1873. Otis Brothers provided the elevator. This is for this particular building, we have one of the few images that tell us, or at least provide some insight into the world of the elevator as it would have existed in shops like Lord & Taylor, but also in the world of the large urban hotel. And while the author of this image has taken some artistic license, the car is much bigger than it probably really was, but almost everyone is seated. We see the elevator operator there. This is an almost domestic kind of scene. And that, in fact, was the world of the passenger elevator for the 1860s and, in fact, into the 1870s. They were not fast. They were not predicated on the notion of meeting the need of American business. And this is also, I think, a good reminder that when we look back from the world from our world in the 21st century, our concept of the elevator doesn't really have much to do with how the elevator was initially conceived and also how it was used for much of the 19th century. We have to recalibrate how we think. Well, how then was this domestic world translated into the world of the office building? Fast-paced business practices. We think of the notion of business in the 21st century working at an incredible speed. In the 19th century, this was the same. We often heard the phrase, the railroad pace of American business, and how quickly people were expected to work and move in and out of offices. How was this technology translated forward? So if this is the prelude, in most talks, we would go from prelude to the sort of main event. But in fact, what we find is it's sort of an interlude. Elevators are introduced into office buildings in the decade of the 1870s, but it's an interlude in the sense of architects, building owners, and users in office buildings had to figure out what this technology meant, how it should be incorporated into a setting very, very different from the settings that the elevator was originally designed to accommodate. So how did this work? We're going to look at a series of buildings and look at where the elevators were placed and get a feel for their incorporation in office buildings. And of course, all of the office buildings of the 1870s are masonry load-bearing construction. Very thick walls, very heavy walls, and we'll see that reflected in the plans. As is well known in histories of architecture, the Equitable Building in New York, completed in 1870, is the first office building to incorporate passenger elevators, in this instance designed by Boston engineer Otis Tufts, the same engineer who designed the elevators in the Fifth Avenue Hotel. The Equitable Building is well known at approximately 130, 135 feet. It was taller than its neighbors, but not extraordinarily tall. It's also a building that conceals its height. It looks like a 3-story building. It's a 7-story building. Well, how are the elevators incorporated into this particular plan? If we look at the first floor plan of the Equitable Building, if we start at the left, you would enter into a sort of a vestibule area off the street, ascend a series of stairs, and then down the main hallway. The center of the plan, we see a large stair that would take us up. The boxes, so to speak, on either side of the stair with the X's in them, those are the 2 passenger elevators that were included in the Equitable Building. A couple of quick observations if we think about how elevators work today. The elevators are far apart. I have no idea which one to stand in front of. There is no real elevator lobby. There's simply a hallway space. And the operation of the elevators was very, very different. I'm going to actually hold on that notion of operation until we get closer to the conclusion. But a very interesting thing does happen with the Equitable Building that hints at the possibilities of incorporating elevators into office buildings. But while it hints at it, we find it was not followed up. And we can see that very clearly. So if we look at the first floor plan again, sort of orient yourself, we can see the little X's for the elevators. We see the openings in the heavy masonry walls. We can imagine standing in that hallway and entering the elevator and riding up to the next floor. If we do that, now we're on the next floor. We can still see the stair at the lower center of the plan. We read the X's telling us where the elevator cars are. Notice that the orientation of the door has changed. We go back to the first floor. We go to the second floor, the door position shifts. Now I can do this today in a modern elevator. It's not that difficult to do. The shift, however, takes place in the Equitable building because it then creates this nice little vestibule area for stairs and elevators. And then that space continues as we go up in the Equitable building. This is, in a sense, the first elevator lobby. And you would think, well, it's great. We've got a paradigm. It's the first elevator lobby. It's the first office building to include passenger elevators. Clearly, this establishes the plan for buildings moving forward. No, it does not. This is not repeated, and this idea is not repeated for approximately 20 years in terms of the notion of a distinct lobby space for the elevator in an office building. The Equitable sort of sets the stage, it incorporates two elevators, and it proves more or less that this technology has a place in the modern office building. Another early building to incorporate elevators was the Bennett building. Again, Otis Tufts provided the elevators for this building. The Bennett building still survives in Lower Manhattan. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous building. If you've not seen it, I would encourage you to do so. The first plans that were published for the Bennett building, which was built as a speculative office building, and this is the plans were published in the New York Herald. This is one of those plans that's been redrawn. Again, we can look for the boxes with the X's in them, and this tells us where the elevators were located. This is a rendering of the first floor plan, and I've never quite figured out exactly what was going on with the stairs here. But the important thing to note about the elevators is their placement. They're on either side. There is no elevator lobby. There's a tiny, tiny little corridor in front. And if I entered the building, the building's more or less divided into two halves. So maybe I would know which elevator to go to ride up. But it's not integrated into the overall concept of the building in any way that we recognize from the 21st century. The elevators are there. Yes, I suppose we could look at it and say, well, they're there and the washrooms are adjacent to it. So it's kind of a technological core, but not really. The Western Union Telegraph building continues this trend, but in a different way, and starts to speak to a different kind of challenge that many of these elevators presented. Western Union Telegraph building, completed in 1875, employed two passenger elevators, both of which were designed by two different designers. Otis Brothers designed one, which was steam powered. Talk about that in a minute. Cyrus Baldwin designed the other, which was sort of hydraulic. Western Union Telegraph, regrettably a building that no longer exists. It's well known to us from photographs. 230 feet from sidewalk to the top of tower, 100 feet taller than the Equitable building. If there was any question that the promise of height, as indicated in the Equitable building, there's any indication that that promise wasn't noticed, Western Union pretty much reminds us that yes, the elevator makes tall office buildings more tenable. Therefore, the Western Union Telegraph took a distinct advantage of that technology. Well, two different elevator types. What kind of technology was employed? The first thing to notice before we talk about the technology, and you can just see this on the section. So we have two sections of elevator cars. If you look at the left image, sort of near the bottom, you can see a section through a bench. There was still a seat incorporated in this elevator car. There would have been in the Equitable building as well. It's very much that paradigm that we found in hotels and shops. I would enter, sit, and ride up and down. The image on the right-hand side, we have a fuller rendering of that bench now lining two sides of the elevator car. The different technologies we're seeing, the elevator on the left-hand side by on the right-hand side by Otis Brothers was steam powered. I will come back to that technology in a minute. The elevator on the left-hand side was known as a water balance elevator. and it was the world's simplest use of water, not in a hydraulic sense in terms of driving a motor, but in a hydraulic sense of balancing the weight of the car. What this section is attempting to show us on the left is the elevator car was connected to, in essence, a very, very, very large bucket. That is what's seen running in the tube to the right of the car. I simply moved one of the handles in the car, the bucket filled with water. When I was pretty sure, remember I can't see the bucket, when I was reasonably certain as the operator that the bucket weighed more than the car, I moved the handle to stop water flowing into the bucket. I pulled the lower handle, which released the brake. The bucket went down, the car went up. When I neared my floor, I applied the brake again and I stopped the car. That was it. That was all the technology that was applied here. The elevator operated for 25 years with no accidents, no problems whatsoever. Well, why do that? Why utilize this sort of strange kind of balancing technology when I have steam engines available to me? If we look at a detail of an Otis, a contemporary Otis elevator, this image actually dates from 1870, but we see above the steam engine, which would have been in the basement of the building, and then below that section, we see a plan showing us the elevator car, and that we very clearly see the bench rendered that we saw in the section through the car, and then the steam engine. The problem with steam engines was, well, they're steam engines. To provide motive power to the elevator, the steam engines had to run all the time so that I could access that engine all the time. They were loud. They were difficult to control. When you started the elevator car, it would have started with a very clear and abrupt jerk. Stopping the car was a little smoother. They were also expensive. It meant I had to continually have a supply of coal fed into a boiler to produce steam to power the steam engine. I had to have a maintenance man in the basement constantly monitoring all of this equipment. So there were a lot of reasons that building owners began to be very frustrated with the idea of the steam engine as the prime motive force for driving these passenger elevators, particularly in office buildings, because the elevator was used a lot. And also in hotels, they also began to have some concerns as well, mostly around safety. As a footnote to this discussion, if we were to look at contemporary technology in Europe, and the passenger elevator in England, for example, is introduced exactly at the same time as it's introduced in the United States, in exactly the same setting, the large urban hotel. The primary differences in England and in Europe, all of the technology was focused on hydraulic elevators, because in most European cities, you were not allowed to have an operating steam engine in the basement of a building for safety reasons. The Europeans thought the Americans, well, were a little reckless, perhaps, in doing this. Also, this particular technology is predicated on a winding drum, a drum with the cable wrapped around it, and it spooled and unspooled the hoisting ropes as the car went up and down. So the Western Union Telegraph is the first building to hint at maybe we need a different kind of technology. Now, the New York Tribune building, first half completed in 1875, the second half completed in 1882, employed steam-powered elevator when it first opened, designed by a gentleman no one's ever heard of, Melanchthon Hanford. When the building reopened in 1882 with phase 2 of the construction completed, all of the elevators had been replaced by Otis Brothers, following a new paradigm. Come to that paradigm in just a minute. Before we get to the elevators, I wanted to show this image, and it hints perhaps at what's to come in this wonderful lecture series that Carol Willis and friends have put together for us at the Skyscraper Museum. This is an image that was specifically requested by the client for this building. Whitlaw Reid, who took over as editor of the New York Tribune after the death of Horace Greeley, Reed was the driving force behind the construction of the new Tribune Tower. And as soon as a preliminary design was completed by Richard Morris Hunt, Reed requested this specific image, he requested that this specific image be produced. We're in City Hall Park. We see the fountain in front of us. We see the Tribune Tower rising center of the image. It has pride of place. What's the most important thing about this image is its emphasis on the Tribune Tower's height. And from Whitlaw Reed's point of view, the building to the right of the Tribune Tower, that was the New York Times building. The building to the left, partly obscured by the tree, was the New York Sun. This was Reed literally thumbing his nose at his rival, saying, I have not only the tallest newspaper building, but at 260 feet, 30 feet taller than Western Union Telegraph, I have the tallest office building in the city of New York. This image was all about height and the power of that building being a tall commercial office building. That was emphasized when the building first opened in 1875. And here we see the front page of the New York Tribune and the image of the building, again, having pride of place. This, however, is a deceptive image in that the elevation that we see where the tower, the tower is embedded, that elevation facing City Hall Park, and then we see the side elevation. The building, in fact, did not look like this. The building looked like this. It was only half finished. We read the 4 bays of the main elevation, which include the tower. We read only 2 bays of the flank elevation, when in fact there are supposed to be 4. Part of the reason that the building was completed in phases is it cost much, much more than originally anticipated. But what this also meant is from 1875 until construction begins on phase 2 in 1881, the New York Tribune Tower looked like this: somewhat slender, a clear emphasis on height, and the Tribune Tower then perhaps putting a marker out for this is what tall buildings can do to urban environments, particularly when they are very clearly much taller than the buildings that surround them. So back to our main focus, how did the elevators work in the Tribune Tower? This is the plan of phase 1, the first story, entering off the street, going up some stairs and into the building. Near the top, we can see 2 elevators placed side by side, nestled in between the L of the stair. If we focus in on that and look at a detail in the plan, the Tribune Tower is the first building that we know of we would now think of this as the world's smallest elevator bank, the 2 elevators placed immediately adjacent to each other. But notice how very carefully the elevators have been rendered, with a bench shown now around 3 sides, so that paradigm still continues. I enter, I sit down, the doors close, and I go up. And once again, there's not really an elevator lobby. In fact, in this instance, we can read the plan dimensions. There's a hallway that's just under 6 feet in width. So not much room to stand, not much room to wait. So not really a sense of an elevator lobby, but I do get an elevator bank, which you would think would set a paradigm. Not really. We don't find that notion. In some buildings, we'll put the elevators together. This was sort of a happy accident, perhaps in the Tribune Tower. However, when the Tribune, and I got it, and as lecturers often do, I got ahead of myself. These elevators also incorporated a feature that had also been incorporated a feature that was also present in the Equitable building. In this little sketch of a section through, toward the left-hand side, you can just make out the word elevator. Again, notice the rendering. There I am, seated on that nice bench, waiting for the elevator to go up. Immediately below my feet, the word there is baggage. The elevator car included a separate chamber below that could be used not for baggage, but for carrying all of the things that are associated with operating a large office building. Supplies, paper, equipment, and other things. And I have, in essence here, a combined passenger elevator and a freight elevator. And that was not an unusual feature in many office buildings, certainly in the 1870s. When the Tribune Tower is completed, in 1882, and this was the plan that was published in the New York Tribune advertising their office space. If we zoom in on the elevator location toward the sort of lower sort of center part of the image, we can see the two elevators that we know were installed when the building was first opened, when phase one opened. If you look near the top of the image, you can also see another little box with an X in it indicating an elevator. If we zoom in on that, this seems to be the strangest place to put an elevator in the world, because the WC there, we see water closet, bathroom, that's the men's restroom. What's an elevator doing in the men's restroom? And it doesn't look like that I can get into it. Well, you couldn't, not on an upper floor. What we're looking at is, if not the first, one of the first express elevators. If we go back to the main plan, this is an upper floor plan. This elevator was accessible only on the ground floor from the Tribune, from the New York Tribune's main offices, and Tribune employees could go into this elevator and then ride up to the Tribune offices, to the printing room located on the top of the Tribune Tower. So we have here the first express elevator from 1882, and we do have evidence that it does begin to speak to the fact that these elevators could be employed differently in office buildings than in their original settings of hotels and shops that don't need express elevators in order to meet the needs of users within a specific building. And the elevators that were incorporated in 1882 in the Tribune Tower when phase two was completed, and I mentioned that the steam elevators that were originally there were replaced, they were replaced with a very specific kind of hydraulic elevator that had been developed in the mid 1870s, specifically with the goal of getting rid of the steam engine and providing an elevator that would make it easier to build taller buildings. The first use of that elevator type that we know of was in the Barrio building, completed in 1879, elevators provided by Otis Brothers. Let's look at the building first, and then we'll look at the elevators that were supplied for the building. This is a very, very early schematic plan of the Barrio building. We see its location next to the Trinity building. The Barrio building was one of the first that we now think of as, in the elegant language of architectural history, a square donut, a building predicated in its design around a central open court. Now, this plan makes it look like the court is open to the sky. The court, however, was capped by an enormous skylight. If we look at a Sanborn map of about 10 years later, the blue in the plan of the Barrio building, we can see there. If we focus in on that center core, or courtyard rather, covered by the skylight, we see the Barrio building doing something completely different, but similar to what we've seen before. 4 elevators now appear in this building in 2 banks opposite either side of the open courtyard. What this meant, and once again, as lecturers do, I got ahead of myself. So what was the technology that was employed in this building? What was the difference here? These were hydraulic elevators, and this was an image that Otis Brothers used in their advertisements. And we see the elevator car in the center. We'll come back to that image of the car in just a few minutes. Just to the left of that car, we see a tall vertical hydraulic engine with a plunger inside, and at the top of it we see a series of sheaves attached. So I have this vertical hydraulic engine that I could place inside the elevator shaft, and by multiplying the sheaves on top, I could have an elevator that could go much, much taller than a steam-powered elevator. And also I had an elevator system that was much, much safer. So this is the elevator system that's employed in the Barrio building that powered these amazing elevators, banked 2 each on either side of the courtyard. And this is the only image so far that has been discovered of how these elevators may have operated. And clearly it's a drawing, an engraving, There's some artistic license taken here, but if you look at the right-hand side, we know that the elevators operated in shafts that were encased in wire screens. So visitors to this building would have seen these elevators rising and falling with this incredibly dynamic display of elevator technology. We're accustomed to that now in many modern buildings. This was the first time that this technology was put on display in this particular fashion. So we have that talking about this sort of dynamic technology. We're in the world of the office building. Engraving sort of a little genteel perhaps in its representation of users. That sort of aspect of that notion here carried into a contemporary rendering of the elevator cars employed in the Barrio building. And again, there's some artistic license here. The bench is still there. Our businessmen are comfortably seated, the operator also seated, not unusual for this time. And this doesn't seem to speak to the sort of power of the office building, the sort of dynamism of what's going on. We're still working on translating that sort of domestic image of the elevator from the 1860s. Now we're getting close to the 1880s. This is the image that is still very much in our minds that everyone has. We can also see that Otis Brothers, if we focus in on the detail of the car from our earlier image talking about the vertical hydraulic elevator, here's our elegantly clad operator, our bench, women waiting to get on board. This isn't an office building. This is clearly a shop or store someplace in New York or in Chicago. 1881 from Otis, a similar kind of domesticated image. So what's going on? Elevators are introduced to office buildings in the 1870s. Architects struggle with where to place them, but what they also struggle with, and now keeping up with our theme, we had a prelude, an interlude, a sort of postlude, if you will, to our interlude when architects are trying to figure out how does this work. The reasons they were struggling with how do these elevators work has to do with two key things: operation and traffic control. Very briefly, how did elevators operate in the 1870s? Take the Equitable building. When they placed the elevators in the Equitable building, they had no idea how to operate them. And here we might think, well, it's easy. You walk up and you push a button and the elevator shows up and you get on board and you ride. There are no push buttons in the 1870s. Throughout the 1870s and most of the 1880s, if I wanted to call an elevator, I did just that. I stood next to the elevator shaft and yelled up or down to try to get the elevator operator's attention. Or I hoped that they noticed me standing there when they went past and they could reverse and come back and get me. The original idea for the Equitable building was, well, we'll operate the elevators like they do streetcars on a set schedule. That clearly didn't work. As we move through the 1870s, what happens is more office buildings are constructed, more elevators are employed, and we finally get sufficient elevators so that in the following decade, at the same time that architects are beginning to struggle in the 1880s with the gradual migration from load-bearing masonry construction to steel construction, we have architects begin to identify guidelines for elevator operation and traffic control. One of the first people to do this, or rather one of the first people to write about this, was Chicago architect John Root. In John Root's famous article, A Great Architectural Problem, Inland Architect, June 1890, he identifies for the first time in print critical aspects of elevator operation and traffic design. The idea of a round trip time, the number of stops, and car speed. By 1890, the idea of, the idea of local and express service had been clearly established, not only in the public's mind, but in the minds of architects who had to design buildings to incorporate elevators. The impact of car size and configuration was also recognized by this time. That cars, to get passengers in and out of effectively, had a maximum size and a preferred orientation, wider rather than narrow cars. Root teases us with something that I'm still looking for the answer to, in which he said there's a clear rule of thumb that the number of elevators you need is proportionate to the cubic contents of a building. And that's it. No formula, no what does proportionate mean other than, I guess if you design enough tall office buildings, you know how many elevators you're supposed to include. So while architects are struggling with the transition from masonry, load-bearing construction to the emerging steel frame and all that that means, as well as other technologies, they're struggling with elevators, and John Root says, well, it's proportionate. Fortunately, 3 years later, oops, and again, as historians want to do, I got ahead of myself, Root also provides something else for us in 1890 that really had not been seen before. He provided a series of 3 schematic plans of office buildings that deal with all kinds of images, all kinds of issues rather, from structure to light. In this particular schematic plan, Root is one of the first people to say, well, you know, we might need a separate area for elevator use for passengers. We see the word hall. You can barely make out the word elevators above that. There were 2 banks of 3 elevators flanking the hall. Root is one of the first architects to say and to conceptualize, you know, we might need something like an elevator lobby, a space off of the main hallway for passengers to wait and to enter and to exit elevator cars. It takes about 20 or so years for the notion of the elevator lobby to really become fixed in the minds of designers, but Root is one of the first ones to hint at this. 3 years after John Root's amazing article, New York engineer George Hill does the first intensive investigation of elevator use in existing buildings. He does this in 1893. This is the first systematic use of a rather collection of data. He looked at the number of stories, the number of elevators, the number of offices, the working speed. Hill was actually one of the first people to recognize that the working speed of an elevator has nothing to do with its contract speed. When a manufacturer would say, oh yeah, the elevator can go 600 feet per minute, and in most buildings it'll operate at about 400 feet per minute. Hill also looked at car size and number of passengers. He collected lots and lots and lots of data. And what he found was that, not surprisingly, well, elevators don't travel that much, 1/3 to 1/8 of the time. The rest of the time they're sitting there. Travel increases with number of stories, and on, and that he did also note that the time the elevators are not running will thus seem to fix the number as well as the size and the speed. So he began to identify a series of critical things to help us figure out, well, how many elevators do I need in a building? And his goal was to boil all of these results down to, as he called it, some uniform law. And then he gave up, because he said that it was impossible to do because the service in each building depends on the class of tenants, and he could not come up with a formula to determine, well, how many elevators do I need? Where should they go? How many local? How many express? And one of the key challenges here in sorting all of this out was what the elevators were carrying. As distinct from Tom Leslie's subject, those amazing grain elevators that he spoke so eloquently about, grain doesn't have a will of its own. Grain doesn't make irrational decisions about getting on and off elevators. Elevators deal with people and how they interact with buildings and with technology, and certainly at this point in time, what also had to do with elevator operators and how they ran the elevators, how they interacted with passengers getting on and off. And that notion that I referenced at the very beginning of my lecture, looking back from the 21st century, elevators operated so fundamentally differently because their operation was dependent on the operator, on a person, not on a computer as it is today. And even by the time we get into the 1890s, we're still sorting this out. How many do we need? How do they need to operate? How will they be incorporated in a building at the same time that architects are struggling with all kinds of other technological innovations? This reminds us both of the complexity of architectural technology and building technology, the complexity of these early tall buildings and why it is so important to set aside our 21st century perceptions and to look back and to try to understand how they were used at the time, how were they conceived of, how they were thought about. It's been my pleasure to talk to you all this evening. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Lee, so much. Here I am back, and I'm going to be joined by Tom Leslie, and Lee will stay on. I see we're very close, very, very, very close to our 7 o'clock hour, but we'll go for a few minutes longer and bring in a little bit of the discussion. But I have to say, as we get Lee and Tom back on the screen, one of the things that we want to do over the course of this semester, over the successive weeks, is to have a kind of evolving conversation. We can take your questions, not tonight, but you know, through the rest of these weeks. We can take your questions. We can't promise that we're going to answer them, but the very best ones we will certainly consider and see if we can't weave them back into the discussion. So as you could see so clearly, Lee is the phenomenal expert of the history of the elevator, the name of his book, the preeminent expert, and someone with an immense encyclopedic knowledge that is universal. It is also arcane and highly esoteric, and it's based not only on his deep research in the archives, but also, as you could see in the last comments, on his comprehensive reading of contemporary sources in order to search out every mention of an elevator and then note where there are no mentions of the elevator in order to do what I hope part of this series is about, is a lot of myth busting about the way the stories have been told in the popular histories. So we want to bring in Tom, who I can't see yet on the screen, and we'll see if we have him here. While we wait for that to happen, I'll keep talking and say, since I didn't give Lee a proper introduction at the beginning, that he is a professor and a dean in the School of Architecture of Design at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. So he's sharing his professorial time with us today. And I'm not seeing my fellow speakers, so maybe Kevin can tell me if they're there or not.
I'm here, Carol. Kevin needs to allow us to share cameras, I think.
And hopefully that's going to happen right now.
I'm also here, Carol.
Yeah, and Tom, if you have some voiceover comments that you want to start with, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's always a pleasure and an honor to share the bill with Lee. And you know, in this kind of double bill, right? The things that the one thing that grain elevators and passenger elevators have in common is the word, right? But I think that thinking about mechanical systems and conveying systems as one of several, I would say, enabling technologies, right? Not determining, but enabling. These, I think, are kind of unwritten histories in a way. I mean, Lee, of course, has done an amazing job of figuring out, sort of teasing out the story of passenger conveyances. But that, of course, is one of many mechanical systems that go into a building. And there, you know, there's a history there that is kind of largely unwritten. The interesting comparisons, I think, you know, I of course appreciated Lee explaining the difference between grain and human beings. It's an important distinction. And Carol, I think, as you were saying the other day, grain don't complain. And so the differences in the history, I think, have a lot to do with you know, the need for safety with passenger elevators, which no one really cared about with grain. Those things went up in smoke all the time, and of course, because people were insured, the losses weren't maybe felt so great. But also interesting, you know, in the mechanisms that I was looking at, both passenger elevators and grain elevators go from steam power to electric power, but elevators have this interesting kind of interregnum where hydraulic elevators become sort of state of the art. And that never happens with grain. Grain goes right from steam to electricity because there's no need for the comfort factor, right? There's no need for the slower operation, the safer operation, the lack of kind of jerkiness. In fact, that's one of the things that you read about in contemporary accounts of grain elevators is that everything is just shaking violently in these buildings because the steam power is so unnuanced. And I think there's a whole dimension of, one of the things that I think the grain elevator history calls attention to isn't just the consciousness of the human passengers who don't like to wait very long, but also the comfort. And that I think is an underrated aspect of architectural history, that human comfort, not only in terms of maybe thermal comfort, which we're used to hearing about, but in this case, maybe we call it kinesthetic comfort or something like that, where when you're in a conveying system that moves, the need to do something that does it at a pace, acceleration, deceleration that doesn't throw people around, make them sick or bruised. So that to me is one of several interesting overlaps. And I wonder if Lee might maybe shed some light on that hydraulic moment and what we know about whether that was in fact a purely comfort thing. I'm sure there are also safety issues involved as well, but that to me is one of the things that the double bill sort of highlights as a maybe important distinction.
Yeah, it just really, in a nutshell, the hydraulic engines got rid of the steam engine, which was a safety factor, but the limitation of all the steam engine elevator machines was the presence of the winding drum. The higher you go, the larger the drum would have to become. It was unwieldy. It took up too much room. And with the hydraulic engines, both vertical hydraulic and horizontal, the very clever engineers figured out by multiplying the number of sheaves in an elevator, the elevator engine might push out 2 feet. The car might move 12 because I have a multiplying capability. It actually allowed taller buildings to be built because it could be more readily adapted. At the same point in time, if you follow the trajectory of hydraulic elevators in the early 20th century, and this speaks to not really against the notion of the sort of very logical evolution of technology. I honestly don't think that happens. Early 20th century, you had some 20-story buildings using direct plunger hydraulic elevators with a plunger rising 20 floors up, not really pushing the car up because it was heavily counterweighted, just sort of balancing it on the either side. It's a very strange notion to do that. Electricity is introduced in a very simple, in an interesting way, in that the first electric motors powered winding drums. They looked exactly like steam elevators with electric motors attached to them. And the advantage was, and this is something we don't talk about with technology, is that it allowed elevators to be put in buildings that didn't have elevators because it was relatively easy. The engines were fairly small, much smaller than hydraulic. And then, of course, the paradigm that really turns the corner and drives all electric elevators today is the development of the electric traction elevator. And Tom, I did want to say, I will return the compliment. I always enjoy when you and I have an opportunity to be together, literally or virtually in this case. But as someone who grew up in the Midwest in a small farming town, I can speak to the power of those grain elevators across the rural American landscape. And one thing that, in thinking about the power of those images, and I know this is a book you know well, and it speaks to their influence on modern architecture writ large, is Le Corbusier's towards an architecture very deliberately including those images in that critical book that served as one of the foundations of modern architecture. I mean, that's not an accident, and I'd love to hear I'm sure you've looked at that, and you can probably tell me what elevators he illustrated and that connection.
Oh, for sure. I mean, the elevators that he looked at, Rainer Banham documented obsessively which elevators precisely Corbusier looked at. They were in Buffalo and Montreal for the most part, but they were the concrete versions. So some of them were engineered by Jason McDonald, the Chicago engineer. So I'll get that plug in there for my town. But I think that one of the appeals of them, right, is that they are literally machines, kind of, writ large. And we often, I think, when we're talking about the historiography of skyscrapers, there is this kind of, I think, outmoded way of thinking of them as technologically determined, right, as giant gadgets. And Carroll in particular, I think, has done a lot to dismantle that. At the same time, with grain elevators, like here we have buildings that are actual gadgets, right? That literally do not have, almost room for human beings in them. They are gigantic machines. And I think that in Corbusier's case, obviously the combination of the, repeated cylindrical forms, which is really a beautiful kind of combination of structural performance and the development of slip forming. Well, it happened to create these incredibly platonic shapes that catch the light in all the ways that Corbusier liked, and are also, very literally anonymous structures. And I think that anonymity or the idea that they are, these giant gadgets, they are sublime in ways that, the Brooklyn Bridge was maybe sublime, or some of these other gigantic monuments of the era, and that's a new experience. And I think even as late as the 20s, when Corbusier is writing, that is still a pretty powerful thing to be up next to a building structure of architectural scale, monumental, whose dimensions really have nothing to do with you, right? Have to do more with the scale of commodities trading and stuff like that. And so I think it's this unique, confluence of aesthetic object and, sublime kind of technological experience that Corbusier just cannot resist. And you're right, they are still super resonant objects. Driving around Iowa, you can, if you know what you're looking for, a town by the shape of its grain elevator, and you can kind of dead reckon your way around by checking them out. You know that as well as anyone.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the silos in the landscape, the grain elevators, out on the plain, in effect, because in a way, and Tom, showed us the cover of William Cronin's great book, Nature's Metropolis. In a way, the landscape version, not the Chicago version, but the landscape version, is a representation of the city. It's a representation of the process of industrialization, the process of urbanization that creates a need for that grain to be grown at effectively an industrial scale at mass production to bring to cities. So there's kind of a complementary meaning to both the one in the open landscape as well as the one at the edge of the city, it seems to me.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And one bit of research that I'd like to keep looking at is how, there's a clear relationship between what are called the country elevators and the terminal elevators, right? The country elevators are there for farmers to deposit their grain to wait for the train. The terminal elevators take the grain off the train and put it on boats. But there's also, I think, an exchange where the big grain elevator builders and engineers are in Chicago, and clearly someone has to go design and build the concrete grain elevator in Gowrie, Iowa, right? That's not a local group that's putting that together. And so one thing that I'm trying to dig into now is whether part of the exchange is actually the technical expertise coming from Chicago and going out into the hinterland to build the country elevators. They're in many cases this, similar scale, similar design. And, to me, it's just a question of, well, is that expertise part of the exchange between the capital and the hinterland?
And it's very much similar to the conversation that we're going to have in 2 weeks, when the second week of paired talks includes Tom Leslie, but beginning with our New York representative, Donald Friedman, who will talk about industrialized structure or industrializing structure, that the modern skyscraper is industrialized structure. And that kind of echo that you see in the later development of the grain elevator, as you say, with the jump forms and creation in concrete. So I have a question about that, which is completely through the mindset of the office building elevator. How tall could they go, and was there an optimal height and a height that was too tall for gravity to operate? Was it just a matter of economy? Was there some efficiency? Why didn't they go taller?
Yeah, that's a good question, and there is discussion about that in the timber elevators. It was a structural issue that what you're dealing with mostly isn't the weight of the grain, it's the hydraulic pressure, right? The fact that it operates as a fluid, and so that by the time you get up to 100, 120 feet, the bursting pressure at the base is really the governing factor. So you see in those timber elevators, the timbers get wider and wider and wider as you get down to the base. And at some point you reach a point of diminishing returns, right? You're building more wood for less grain storage. In concrete, there doesn't seem to be quite as much limitation on the height, because you can just put more steel into the cylinders, right? The cylinder is the perfect shape to resist bursting stress, and you just load it up with more and more steel reinforcement. I suspect that there's almost a kind of opposite issue with commercial skyscrapers, which is that most of these structures are getting built in places where there's no real limitation on spreading out, right? The land that they're building on is actually not valuable. What is valuable is the proximity to the river. And so I think there's just a kind of convenient height. Once you go over 100, 120 feet, it just takes so long for the slip forms to do their thing that you're better off having more formwork, making more cylinders, than trying to build one that's particularly tall. I think you get into wind loads and things like that as you get over 120, 140 feet also. So I think with elevators, that just seems to be a convenient point past which there's no reason to just not build another silo right next to the one you're working on.
Mm-hmm. Lee, I wonder if you have any kind of final comments. We can't go on too long, but I think what this conversation has showed, that the idea that we're having as this series proceeds is the advantages of doing a kind of flipped lecture in the college course parlance, to record, not only to record the talks earlier, but also make them available earlier, so that we can spend more time in conversation, where people will have the lecture under their belts already, and then the speakers can join in dialogue, and the audience might be able to join in the question and answers too, because there's clearly no limit to the knowledge that you can bring to that, and there are endless questions that we can continue to ask. So Lee, by way of conclusion for tonight's session, I wonder if you have anything you want to say.
The only thing I would, one, Carol, thank you so much, and for inviting me to participate. This has been great fun. I always enjoy working with you. It's always fun to work with Tom. The only observation that I would make, and this is, I think, a real challenge for historians going forward, and Tom addressed a lot of this in his talk, is we really don't know how people used a lot of this technology that we talk about. One of the things I am still searching for are detailed accounts of what elevator operators really did in the 1880s and 1890s, how people really thought about riding in the elevators. It's there, it's hard to find. And that's, you know, that literal human factor of how did people really respond beyond sort of sensational newspaper accounts or sort of puff pieces that, as Tom pointed out, and here are our great buildings. Well, what were people doing in them? There's a lot of work that still needs to be done, I think, to really understand how people use them. And I know that Don Friedman and others, you know, and the people who built them, you know, what were they doing? What were they thinking? There's this incredible rich story that I'm looking forward to us, I hope, uncovering as we move forward.
Well, I hope so too. And what I think tonight showed us is that there are subjects that we haven't explored at all in the larger academic community and certainly in the general audience. And then there's the things that we think we know so well in the general and popular history that are dispensed everywhere, that are almost impossible to erase, and yet are untrue or need to be questioned again and maybe rewritten. So rewriting our skyscraper history is going to include both of those things, embracing other themes, but also questioning the ones that seem all too settled now. So thank you both very much for two wonderful, wonderful lectures. For everyone still listening, and what you'll hear what you'll see in the follow-up email is that both of these talks, the whole length of them, will be posted on our website. Right now, Tom's is up, and as soon as we possibly can, we'll get Lee's up as well, so that you'll just be able to go to the landing page of the whole series and now click on the completed videos. And we will keep you posted with all of the evolving better ideas that we have moving forward. So next week, please do join us for Richard Hawes' talk about the Brooklyn Bridge. So that's in between what is normally our alternating week schedule, where we have 2 lectures every other week. And we will figure out how to get that conversation going. In week 2, it's masonry and metal, and looking especially at structural engineering and structures. And then we move to something which is already predicted in the discussion today, corporate and commercial, or corporate or commercial values and how to interpret the history of the high rise in that theme. So good night, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time.